authors of the article Advancing Qualitative Meta-Studies, QMS, Current Practices and Reflective Guidelines for Synthesizing Qualitative Research, published in the April 2025 issue of the Organizational Research Methods Journal. Stefanie and Markus, thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
And as always, for the interview today, we'll talk about the background of the paper, the motivation of the authors to write this paper, the experience with the review process, as well as their perspectives on how to take this research forward. So to start us off, Stefanie and Markus, could you give us a brief highlight of this article and how you think this article can help research and scholar?
Right. So, so for us, this piece is actually what we see as a foundational piece for hopefully a lot of researchers who want to learn about QMS and conducting a QMS themselves. So it's basically for everyone who wants to get familiar with the methods. It's a very, I would say, foundational piece to get to know what this method is all about. So you can learn different approaches of how you can do a qualitative meta study. So in our article, we basically review everything that has been done in the field of management in the past 20 years, because before that, there was not a lot going on. And we basically mapped out different approaches of qualitative meta studies in the field of management. And we came up with round about 3 main approaches, how you could do it: a descriptive one, a confirmatory one, and an exploratory qualitative meta study. And in particular, for those interested in building theory and advancing theory, the confirmatory QMS and the exploratory QMS are particularly interesting. And for these 2 approaches, we develop reflective guidelines for researchers so that you have not a rigid template that you can follow, but actually questions that you can ask yourself, ideas how you can engage with different types of qualitative meta studies. And for us, it was very important to show that it is not a one-size-fits-all QMS out there, because that was a bit of what was assumed very often, and people were not really talking to each other. We saw there were not a lot of cross-references in these articles. And we basically show that there are indeed different ways of conducting a qualitative meta study, and this is what we're going to show in this paper. And now Markus can jump in.
Yeah, maybe a couple of other thoughts. So, of course, one of the starting ideas is, why should you do a qualitative meta study at all? Yeah. So, and I think there are different ways of how you can synthesize research. Yeah. So you can do like systematic literature review. You can do quantitative meta studies. You can do qualitative meta studies. And I think this is what we were motivated. So when you usually do a traditional systematic literature review, it's very helpful, and you can, of course, tease out new future research avenues, but it's not really designed for theory building. And that's what we became more interested in. So in how far can you advance the method for different ways of theory exploration and theory building? And that's basically why we became so interested in working on QMS. So we have done a couple of them by ourselves. This was, I think, one of the key motivating things. Yeah, when the field is somehow fragmented and you are trying to make sense of this fragmentation of case evidence, and then using a method that will tease out interesting patterns that you can then use for interesting theory building. And I think this was one of the motivation. And there are other motivations because there are also other methods how you can synthesize existing qualitative research, but not all of them are actually capable of also doing process theorizing. Yeah? So we were in particular interested in doing process theorizing in our GMS, the 2019 paper on organizational failure. And then we thought, but what could we do in order to have a broader methodology that also helps for process theorizing? And in this respect, we thought that was particularly interesting to have a method that can also deal with process data. Further thoughts? I think there are a couple of other thoughts, yeah, because we thought about the meta practices, yeah, that kept us quite busy, yeah, Steffi?
Yes, I don't know if you come to that point, but I think one of the main issues and I think advancements in the review process was also that we were pushed towards thinking not what are these guidelines and what are maybe different choices researchers can pursue when they engage in a QMS, but also what are basically meta practices, capabilities, skills a researcher needs to engage in this kind of research. Because if we go one step back and think about what is a qualitative meta study, it's basically that you're going to synthesize and reanalyze existing qualitative case material, and then you use basically that data to generate new theory. And obviously that has implications on different levels in terms, obviously, on philosophical assumptions that you have, what can you synthesize, but also three, what we mapped out, meta practices, and we called them translation, abstraction, and iterative interrogation. So in these three meta practices, we mapped out also a bit in the paper, which are very fundamental if you rethink case material that someone else has basically already interpreted from the primary data and that you then use to reanalyze and to build theory. And that was, I would say, one of the fundamental advancements in the review process, where the reviewers and also the editor helped us a lot to frame it also around these more broader practices. You need some sort of special skills, capabilities when you engage with this kind of methodology.
But maybe to complement on this, because I think we also, and this was interesting, because we also thought about how do we work, yeah, together, yeah, when we start analyzing this data. And sometimes, of course, you get the impression in some of the method papers, there's the cookbook, and then you just follow basically the recipe, and then all of a sudden you get a great dinner. But that's not how it works, yeah. And I think, although I'm not a chef in cooking, yeah, but I think it's also a craft. So you really have to understand the craft of doing a QMS. And this was, I think, some of these three practices were very helpful for us to think about what is the underlying craft behind doing a QMS. Because like abstraction is like a key task, or and Langley would call the creative leaping. So how do you how do you abstract from what you see basically in the data and then translate it into more abstract terms, yeah, that actually have a theoretical meaning? But that's a difficult thing. Or whenever we work on a QMS, so we engage what we call in this iterative interrogation. Yeah, that may sound a little strange, yeah, but it's so you basically circle around. Yeah, so you have the data on the one hand side that try to capture specific phenomena, but then we use like different types of angles and perspectives, and then basically discuss in the room how can we interrogate, can we understand and frame the data maybe differently, and which one is the most plausible one. Yeah, so, and I think these meta practice, nobody really talks about them usually, because we just have the list of recipes, yeah, the recipe that we have to follow. But I think that's the core, the key, yeah, the key thing if you want to do it good, understanding these meta practices and then putting them into action.
Yes, thank you both for the brief highlight and also the overview of the motivation of the paper and some of the challenges and how you navigate the process. And in addition to what has been shared, Stefanie and Markus, do you have other challenges during the completion of this paper and the review process this paper, and how did you navigate that? What are some of the valuable experience that you have gained from this process that will be helpful for the audience to know?
Steffi, you want to share the full story? I mean, it has quite a long story. Huh?
It has a long story. I mean, I would first like to highlight that we had an incredibly constructive review process and a very supportive editor. And I think that was extremely helpful to push the paper forward. Because to be truly honest, this review process was challenging, because out of the review process, we developed two substantially different papers. So the end result is very far away from the original submission. Really, literally, no sentence is the same. It's entirely shifted. And two versions in between are also entirely different. So it was kind of a very constructive, but for us as well, a thought process that the reviewers very genuinely and the editor helped us go through. And I think we didn't imagine the output like this when we started, but I think it came out quite well also for organizational research methods. But yeah, it was kind of a journey, I would say. Yeah. But Markus, you want to share maybe a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, we actually you submitted a piece, or we submitted a piece to AOM, I think in 2018. Yeah, then that won the Research Method Best Paper Award. But it was that was a completely different paper. It was a completely different paper because we had the idea that taking like different philosophical stands, like a realist stance, a constructivist stance, would inform different ways of doing a QMS, yeah, and then relating it to process theorizers. So that was an idea, but it's nothing of this is back in the paper, yeah, yeah, and I think that was the starting point, and I think for those who go on a journey to publish an interesting paper, maybe in all the research methods or in some of the other impactful outlets, I think that's what you have to learn. You have to accept that you have an idea which is good enough to make it through the first round, but probably you have to rewrite and rethink many of these things. Yeah. And then I think from our experience, it's actually made the piece much better, more precise, more clearer. So yeah, we very much appreciated the feedback, but not only the feedback. What I see, like with many high impact journals, is they became non-patient, and that's not helpful, because this was great, yeah, because OIM was very patient with us, yeah, because obviously we had to rethink fundamental ideas of the paper, and they were patient. They gave us a time to do so, yeah. So it's not that they chased us like in 3 months you have to resubmit your resubmission. I'm not quite sure what the guideline is currently, but I think this was really, really helpful, yeah. So like a typical, very constructive editorial work.
Yeah, two kids were born in between, so that was also like it prolonged the process, but yeah, it was very supportive, because obviously there are sometimes life hits and things cannot proceed as quick as we wish, and that was very helpful, but also for us to really think this through. And as Markus mentioned, the first draft of the paper was very conceptual in a way, also like rethinking method, and then it moved through the review process, and it became in itself a meta study of all the published QMS out there, and then we synthesized what they have done in the field. So it also now includes an empirical part that was never intended to be in that paper before. But this helped us much more to provide a rigorous foundation for these actual reflective guidelines and meta practices that we wanted to talk about. Because first it was much more about developing these guidelines based on our own experience, and then we had also this empirical foundation that helped us to also link it much better to what is already out there and connect the dots that have not been connected before, because the field was very fragmented. As I said, there were not a lot of cross references between published QMS.
And I think this was also interesting because since we were pushed to do this like literature research more systematically, so we also found nuances we weren't really aware in the beginning. Yeah, so because as Steffi said, so we had rather the conceptual view on the field, and this helped us to tease out. Initially, I think we had the three versions, like the descriptive, then the confirmatory and exploratory, and then the descriptive is not so interesting to do like a QMS. So we focus basically on the two guidelines. So how can you do like a interesting confirmatory QMS, and how can you do a good exploratory QMS for theory building?
Yes, and during your time developing this paper, going through the review process, what is your evaluation of the use of QMS in organizational research? Or the evaluation of the method as a whole that have been applied in organizational research?
So I think one of the big challenges is also it's a very novel method in our field. So it's not that it is used broadly across disciplines in the management or across different fields in the management studies. It's very different in healthcare, for example, where it's a standard method. And there are a lot of resources that you can also draw on. It works a bit different over there. But what I think is, I mean, that was on the one hand a challenge, because always when you publish a novel method that is not that known, not that popular so far, people are usually a bit more skeptic, and you have to prove yourself a bit more, I would say. But on the other hand, I think it's a very great opportunity to introduce it to the field. And now we see actually more and more QMS popping up, also in very good journals, in not only JMS, but also Business and Society. So there are now more and more people engaging with the method and thinking it through also in different ways. So we see also these kind of nuances emerging, that people are not using the one size fits all approach, but rather also thinking it as, okay, this is something I can adapt to my research needs and to the research question I want to answer.
So I think in this respect, there becomes more interest, in the method, and especially since the method works differently than some of the others that are more established in the field. So in this sense, I think it's a great encouragement, and therefore the paper, of course, helps, because it creates also legitimacy for this method in the management organization field. But as Stefanie already said, so in some other fields, it already has a well-established legitimacy in the field, such as healthcare. But I think there are a couple of things that we also highlight in the paper that could be of interest, because there are still degrees of misunderstandings how this works. I think one of the key things that we sometimes also face as when writing or submitting a QMS is, what type of studies can you actually synthesize? So there is one, of course, there's one camp that basically argues, oh, you can only synthesize the rigorous top-tier journal publications, or good journal publications, and then there's the other camp that would say, but you could also include or be more inclusive, be more inclusive and include also other sources of evidence, especially well-published educational cases. And it's very interesting. So when you deal with editors, then some are open to include educational cases, and some would say, that's it was basically written for a specific audience, and they basically foster the idea, oh, maybe it's too biased, you should not do this, and this is interesting, because when we do, for instance, a typical interview study, like a case study, then nobody would question that the interviewee is biased, So of course, he or she will represent his or her story on how the organizational change unfolded. But when you talk about using, let's say, a Harvard business case, then, oh no, it's biased, you cannot use this, And it's very interesting, because there are different publication strategies, and there's no consistency in the review process, in how far this is accepted or non-accepted, You find AMJ articles that basically use educational cases, and obviously there are some that never got published, because we don't see them. They have been taken out of the review process, So this is very, very interesting. And I think we have a more inclusive perspective on this, because you can indeed learn also from synthesizing educational cases. Probably you have to scale up the number, yeah. But this is also pieces of evidence that could be of interest, yeah, for QMS.
Yeah, and I think a very important point is, and we mentioned that in the paper, that it's not just about what kind of material do you include as data in your QMS, but also how do these data align with your onto-epistemological assumptions that you make, right? I mean, because if you want to describe a phenomenon, and you may ask a question that is more relying to an interpretive stance, you also need maybe evidence that also captures this. Whereas when you're more towards a positivist or a very, let's say, a very traditional realist stance, maybe you may need other data, right? And I think these are questions that we raise in the paper, because it's not that one source of data is better than the other. It's just how does the data, how do data fit basically to the question that you asked. And obviously every question that you ask is rooted in some sort of philosophical assumptions, and this is fundamental when you engage with a QMS. So it's not just you put everything into into the bucket and then you reanalyze, and that will not bring you interesting insights. Even that may lead to some flawed conclusions, but we try to raise awareness and sensitivity to also this this idea that you need some sort of rigorous epistemological understanding of what you want to do.
And from your evaluation of the use of QMS in organizational research, what are some of the future directions to further develop this methodology and its use in organizational research, you think?
I think what is currently happening, that people are just exploring it with different types of phenomena, is fantastic. So we see a lot in the CSR research, where researchers are synthesizing CSR policies, qualitative studies that have published on CSR policies. We see it in a lot of different areas in the strategy area. So there are, I think this is something quite interesting, because now people are starting to experiment and engage and develop also novel ways of engaging with that. So what I think, at least what is particularly interesting for us, is we have very much focused on this theory building aspect, and which is nice because that's an endeavor we do as researchers. But there is something that is also puzzling us. So how can you basically use a QMS also to develop maybe policy recommendations, something that is more of not only a theory advancement, but also a practice and policy advancement. So this is something that is interesting, and Markus will maybe elaborate a bit more on that, like incorporating design aspects into QMS. I think that's something we are particularly interested for the future.
Yeah, maybe just picking this topic up. I think this is an interesting thing, and the hardcore critiques of QMS, yeah, that may come from a very hermeneutic or constructivist position. They usually, of course, would say, but there is this the niceness of this idiosyncratic case, yeah, and now, of course, you're taking it away, yeah, because it's so nicely embedded, and you really have to take this like local knowledge and these practice into account, yeah. That is true, yeah. So of course, yeah, because it becomes, you're trying to synthesize patterns across different cases, and each of these cases obviously operate under different boundary conditions. But the thing, and this is what we can do, is so you try to develop patterns across these cases, and they can inform future theorizing, but they can also inform policymakers, yeah. And especially when it comes to making a link, for instance, to design science, yeah, then it could be quite interesting. So what do we actually learn from the many cases that are out there on whatever sustainability transition, on digital transformation, and how far can this actually inform design science projects? Because we can draw on specific piece of evidence, so it can support evidence-based management in this regard, and then helps us to better get a grip on our practical problem solving. And I think this would be an interesting link where increasingly scientists are also asked, yeah, so what's your impact? Yeah, so yeah, maybe we can make an impact by helping you, showing systematically what could be used in your digital transformation or sustainable transformation projects.
Yeah, and if you think about it, I mean, quantitative meta-analysis, they are referenced everywhere. So they are of high value for a lot of implications, also for policy implications. So drawing some conclusions. And I think qualitative meta studies can not do exactly the same, but they have also a value in itself that you have this kind of localized contextual knowledge. And if you put that together and look from it, maybe from, obviously you need to make yourself or your own view on the world transparent, but if you say, okay, this is what I see when I look at all these cases together that nobody has ever looked at together and connect the dots, I can show you a pattern. And that's interesting and that's important. And we have not seen that before. And I think this is, on the one hand side, not only interesting for theory, but really tremendously important also when we think about the main issues that we have to solve with the, like Markus said, the climate crisis and so on, sustainability transition. So this could be of high interest because we have so much single case studies out there that show interesting insights, and connecting the dots can be of high value that you can do by a qualitative meta study.
But there may be also other ways, yeah, in which direction QMS could be developed. So if we think about there are other ways of how we can theorize, yeah, so we can use basically the data for different forms of theorizing. So we can use it, of course, traditionally with configuration theorizing or process theorizing. But maybe it would be also interesting to use it if you come from the Frankfurt School and critical management studies. Hey, maybe this can be also used for problematizing, yeah. Status quo. So that would be a very different way, of course, how a QMS would be used, would be adopted. That's not yet part of the discussion, but using it for this reflexive, critical, problematizing purpose, yeah, which is very different, but that can also help. So this may be also a way to advance QMS in a different direction of theorizing.
And maybe one last remark, because that's a project we are also currently working on, because we got very interested in that. And that's I think it's more of a methodological challenge. So how, or is there a way to incorporate different paradigmatic, ontologically and epistemologically different cases? Because that's, I think, a main challenge, because on the one hand side, we often assume a researcher is in some way capable of understanding the material he or she analyzes and then synthesizes. But is there a way to have different philosophically grounded evidence or empirical material that you can synthesize? Is there a method? And this is something we are currently trying to explore. So we try it out, we do it, yeah. But we haven't come up with a full solution. But this is something I think that is highly interesting, because we have this kind of multi-paradigm theorizing. There have been some AMRs published on that, but this is a discussion that have been very silent over the past decade, I would say. And I think that's something interesting to revive, basically, and to think about it, especially with QMS. Yeah.
Maybe to pick this up, because there's the easy answer to this: it doesn't work. Yeah. So, I mean, if you come from postmodernism, then you would say, yeah, no, it's incommensurable. Yeah. So that's the incommensurability thesis. So they have been developed with different epistemological foundations. So it's it's incomprehensible. Yeah, because they just do different things. Yeah. But I think this is too easy. It's too easy. It's too easy also from an epistemological perspective, because sometimes they may provide on different levels competing evidence. Yeah. On specific facets. Yeah. But of course, we're still working on how you could do this. So without throwing the whole philosophical debate overboard, because I think you need a good philosophical foundation to explain how you could actually do methodologically this type of synthesis across studies that actually have been created with different philosophical foundations. But that's the puzzle, the riddle we are trying to work on.
So there's a lot to work on.
Yeah, there are many others. Yeah, of course. Yeah, but
yes, thank you both for sharing some of the future directions and also raising again the value of QMS in synthesizing studies of unique contexts and various epistemology. And with that, do you have advice for scholars who are interested in using QMS as their method for organizational research?
yeah. Maybe I start with a negative advice, yeah, and then maybe Steffi, you have a positive.
Yes.
I think we also have the discussion about AI, yeah. So and then so people may have the idea, why don't you just throw all these cases into an AI machine and then it just will spit out some kind of patterns, yeah. But I think this is there is, and as we also discuss it with our meta practices, AI creates an illusion of understanding, and AI doesn't have a position. And I think this is if you want to do a good, rigorous QMS, yeah, you need to take a stance and a position. And then, of course, when engaging in this theorizing, translation, abstraction, iterative interrogation, this is extremely helpful and important because you as a team will basically learn their different ways of how you could actually read the data, yeah? AI would not do this, yeah? So that's, it's spitting out some kind of like a shallowness of results. Yes, there will be some results, but it will certainly not be enough for a good theorizing paper. So you may use it as a source of inspiration, but it's not doing your job.
Yeah, on a positive note, maybe.
Oh, yeah, it's a warning. This is more like a warning. Yeah, so it's not yet doing this.
Yeah, I would, I think for everyone who starts engaging with it, because I was also starting as a PhD student with the method, I think it's fantastic that there are so many good exemplars out there. So look at them. So I think there are fantastic QMS by Nicolas Berente from the Information Systems field. Of course, Christina Hohn's 2013 landmark paper in ORM is also there. There are very recent, I think, fantastic CSR meta studies in business and society. So you have, and they're all different. And I think that's amazing. Also, our study in JMS in 2019 on organizational failure, you can see if you want to look at them, they're all different and they're all specifically tied to the research question they want to answer. So just make sure that you do not fall into the trap of using it as a template, one of these studies, but rather try to develop it in your way that answers your research question. I think our ORM helps to map out these different practices. And I still like another ORM article by Pratt and colleagues, which was in the template special issue, where they also talk about this bricolage approach. So it's also a bit like this. So you can choose some of these ideas that we promote in the article. Either you are more in the confirmatory area or more in the exploratory area, but still try to be open and engage with the material and adapt the method to the needs in your study. So I think that would be my recommendation. So don't use it as a template.
Maybe another recommendation would be you also have to think about what type of theorizing would you like to do? Yeah, if you, of course, would go for a theorizing paper, yeah, because I think that makes a difference, yeah, a clear difference. So if you want to develop whatever kind of like transformational or process theorizing paper, then it all has implications, of course, for what type of material you are looking for, yeah. In how far there's a richness of a process that is described in the initial studies and all these things, yeah. Or if you would go for a very traditional, whatever, typology configurational paper, or maybe in the future you may look also for a problematizing paper, yeah. So then you have to, that has all implications, of course, for the design of your QMS. And it's better if you think about it first, yeah, what could be the outcome? instead of doing the QMS and what am I going to do with it?
Those are really helpful advice, and I appreciate the warning of not overusing, not over relying on AI. Also, the flexibility and opening to creativity, to adaptivity of the recommended practices that is not only in your article but also from previous work that have used QMS. Thank you both. And before we wrap it up, is there other advice or notes that you want to share with the audience that we have not covered today?
QMS is fun. No, really. I mean, it's really fun to work with because you have a fragmented field on a specific topic, yeah? And then you have all these different puzzle pieces with different studies. And then in the end, if you do it well, so you get a better, interesting, coherent pictures. And this is fun because all of a sudden you have this idea of, yeah, now I have a much better understanding how things are. Yeah, so it's fun. Just try to work with it.
Yeah, maybe one last remark. So I agree with that. But it's also more fun if you do it in a team, I would say. Also have experienced both. I would say it's really enriching doing it in the team because the kind of interpretations that you can reach, you can profit from a good and from a diverse team.
And there's still some quite physical work, yeah, when you have like a whiteboard and you write all these different ideas on the whiteboard and then you erase them again, yeah. So that's part of the process. Sometimes when we're just in the digital world, I think this is not always well imitated through digital tools. At least, but maybe I'm too old, I don't know. But at least that was our experience. This is how these meta practices actually work. Yeah. So when you sit face to face in a room and then you really discuss what is it. Yeah. And of course, you can do many things also digitally, but using your hands and writing it basically on the whiteboard, and then that's the body-mind interaction and then face-to-face interaction makes a difference in stimulating creativity. Let's put it this way.
Yes, thank you for the last remarks, and I do relate in like the physical touch in the process. That reminds me of when I take my qualitative class and analyze the interview codes, have it in separate lines, cut it into pieces of papers, and really like seeing it. Thank you for re-emphasizing the excitement of the process and also the importance of collaboration in using this method. And Markus and Stefanie, again, thank you for your time and your work in providing the practices and recommendations of the use of QMS and advancing the use of QMS in organizational research as well. Thank you.